wealth of information in both these books. I want to start with, there's probably perception when people start to understand what the book's about, or even with the title of the first book, The Self-Driven Child.
Yeah.
What's the, how do you immediately get people's guards down, or parents' guard down when it comes to being able to just approach the book with an open mind?
Well, it really, it hasn't been that hard. The Self-Driven Child came out a little over 3.5 years ago. And the basic premise is that having a sense of control, which means that you don't feel helpless, you don't feel hopeless, you don't feel overwhelmed all the time. Just having that sense of, I can manage things, I can handle things, stressful things come up, I can deal with it. That healthy sense of control is extremely good for everything. And I think it's pretty easy to frame for parents and educators the various ways with that sense of a control or autonomy. It just benefits. It's so important from a mental health point of view, and also from a motivational point of view, that it's not easy necessarily. What we ask parents to do isn't always easy emotionally, because some of it is you have to sit on your hands and zip your lip and let your kid make decisions and try stuff out. But the logic of it and the science behind it are pretty compelling.
So let's talk about that's great, because the logic and science is important. I've spent a lot of time understanding my brain. I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 21, I believe.
Okay.
But it was something, and I think we want to get into avoidance a little bit later, but it's something, that was avoided, I think, in terms of a topic up until that point. And I never really took it seriously until I was 38, which was just a couple of years ago. And one of the real benefits of taking the diagnosis seriously is going into the brain and understanding the science behind, why taking this seriously is really important to give your children, what they need to be successful.
Yeah.
So the science behind this, maybe you can set up, why the brain is going to like having this sense of control, and why the child really just thrives when they have that that environment.
Right. So a couple thoughts. What I got turned on to a sense of control in part from a scientist by the name of Steve Mayer, who's at the University of Colorado. And he's been studying a sense of control for 30 some years. And the initial paradigm was having rat A and rat B in plexiglass cages. Their tails are outside the cage with a little electrode on them. Rat A gets shocked. And it's not a real painful shock, but it's an annoying shock in his tail. And he wants it to stop. And he discovers there's a wheel in the cage. If he turns the wheel, the shock stops. So rat A has the experience of being able to control a stressful situation by turning the wheel. And what happens in the rat's brain when he's turning the wheel is the prefrontal cortex activates, and when this prefrontal cortex activates, it dampens down the stress response. And so it's not that stressful, and rat A just goes into coping mode. And rat A, then later, you disconnect the wheel, so it doesn't stop the shock anymore. He still just goes into coping mode, and it's not that stressful. As he's turning the wheel, nothing's happening, but he just keeps turning, and it's not that stressful. You put him in a cage with big, scary rats, he doesn't freak out. He goes into coping mode. Rat B gets shocked, turns the wheel, and nothing happens. His shock only stopped when rat A turns the wheels. He didn't have that experience of control. And so you think about it, the way you have confidence, you can handle challenging situations, is you handle challenging situations. And we also know that the kind of a related finding is the best neurological marker of resilience and really kind of mental health in general is the strength of the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex, the most recently evolved part of the brain, that can think. They can put things in perspective. They can start to calm you down when something, kind of coach you into what to do when something stressful happens. The prefrontal cortex and the amygdala being the primitive part of your brain that doesn't think, it just senses and reacts to perceived threat. And when you have strong connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which is what you see in people who have a high sense of control, is that they aren't stressed that easily because something stressful happens, but they figure it out. They have confidence in that ability to cope. So it's also true from a motivational point of view. The brain loves spontaneously pursuing things of interest. And what we want to develop in kids is that intrinsic motivation. So there's a lot of different angles from a stress point of view, stress-related disorders like anxiety and depression, where you think about it, if you're anxious, your thinking's out of control. If you're depressed, you can't get out of bed, you have no sense of control. So it's hugely related to mental health, and mental health problems are stress-related problems that affect the brain.
And I love your call for prevention, right, of mental health issues, is to have great connections with your kids and give them the sense of self-control that they need to have the confidence to address tough issues. So you will let them out of the house.
Well,
ready to go. They might not know they might not know their career path, but at least they'll be able to face the challenges as they begin to face that head on, post high school life.
That's what we want. And in our new book, the first chapter is about communicating with kids in a way that builds connection, because having a close relationship with a parent is about as close as you can get to a silver bullet protecting kids from emotional problems.
Can I stop you there for 1 second?
Yeah.
Sorry, because this is great. You talk about it as a silver bullet. Give me some research on that, right? Like, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think that's an important point, right? So let's back it up a little bit. Is there anything you can point to, or
anecdotally? I mean, there's a whole body of research dating from, I think, the 1950s on attachment. Attachment meaning that close bond that develops between a child and a caregiver, usually a parent, and with secure attachment by 18 months. The paradigm is that you take an 18-month or two-year-old toddler into a waiting room someplace, and they'll stay close, say their mother, they'll stay close to their mother with strong attachment, because that's where the security is. And then they'll venture out. They'll play with stuff. A stranger comes in the room, they'll go back to their mom, but then they'll venture out again. And they use that with a secure attachment, they use the parent as a safe base. And that's with insecure attachment. You see kids who then never leave their mother. They don't pay attention to their mother, and that secure bond where kids feel safe in this world. And the other end, there's a lot of research on affluent kids, kids who in high achieving schools who don't feel as close to their parents as kids who are middle class families or even poorer families. And that research has suggested that those kids are at much higher risk for anxiety disorders, depression, substance use disorders, self-harm than kids in middle-class kids. And the hypothesis is because they report feeling less close to their parents.
And you talk a little bit about, does this relate to the competence focus over other areas of development when it comes to how a child's raised in the classroom and in their home?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts about that, Joe. One is that there's a report written in 2017 by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that summarized what are the causes of mental health problems in adolescence. And the first four were poverty, trauma, discrimination, and excessive pressure to excel. And in both our books, we talk about something called self-determination theory, which is, I think, that the most useful theory of motivation. And it holds it to be intrinsically motivated, that internal motivation, that self-drive that we talk about in our first book. You have to have three needs fulfilled. One's for a sense of relatedness. You have to feel connected to somebody, and yet you have to have a sense of competence and a sense of autonomy. And what Ned, my co-author, and I are concerned about is every place we go, every place we've talked about, we've been in 26 states talking about the self-driven child. And every place we go, people talk about how incredibly stressed kids are because of the strong focus on competence, on achievement, as if nothing else mattered. And I think that it doesn't often at the great expense of our relationships and the promotion of autonomy.
So there's an opportunity today, with the pandemic, there opened up, different options for people for school choice. And that was real for us, right? The virtual did not work. And we found ourselves in a Montessori program, both for our 7-year-old. And he's in his second year there now. And man, I see the absolute difference in the classroom, obviously, right? And how they run that.
Yeah.
And in year one, not so much. It's kind of a weird year last year as well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But a couple months in now, I'm really, really appreciating that approach. Do you have anything to say about, number one, maybe the opportunity for parents, as part of their exploration to give their children more choice? Because I think you speak about this in the way, give them choices on where to go to school, right? And maybe now, things like Montessori, which may have been not mainstream, they're still certainly not mainstream, but now they're more of an opportunity and maybe more of an option. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I have a couple of thoughts, and depending on where you live, I mean, there are. I'm in the greater Washington, D.C. area, and there's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of independent schools. And people, if they can afford it, they have a lot of choice. And I see kids who are miserable in some school settings and very happy in others. And I think it can make a huge difference, as you're saying, Joe. And I think in terms of the choice part, in the self-driven child, we talk about there's a chapter on the importance of supporting kids in making their own decisions, and I felt my whole career that the best message you can give a teenager, besides "I'm crazy about you," is that I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your own life and to learn from your mistakes, and I want you to have a ton of practice doing that before you leave home. Because that's the way people learn to make good decisions and trust themselves, is that they make decisions. And so, and I got to this in part, Joe, because early in my career, it was quite common for kids to repeat kindergarten or first grade in the public schools. And that's changed now. But then, and I'd see these 19-year-old kids. I'd say, where are you in school? They'd say, well, I'm a senior in high school. I should be a freshman in college, but my parents made me repeat the first grade. They were still pissed about it 12 years later. It seemed kind of crazy to me. So what I started, and this may sound crazy, what I started to do is tell parents, let's tell the kid, nobody's going to make you repeat first grade, but this is going to be your call. But talk to Dr. Stixrud, let's talk to your teachers, and you can make a good decision. I'd see these 6 and 7-year-old kids, Joe, who think all summer about the right thing. They talk to people, and at the end of the summer, they'd say, "I think I'm ready," or "No, I know I need to stay back," and I know that doesn't mean I'm stupid. And it just blew me away. And I'm not suggesting that 6 and 7-year-olds make all their own decisions. But I am suggesting that this idea that we support kids, we treat them respectfully, and like they have a brain in their head, and they want their life to work, and that they have their own preferences. They have their own angle on things that we respect. I think that's a really useful thing. And so in school choice, parents in DC, there's so many choices. Parents often say, I need her to be in a much better school. The kid doesn't want to leave. And my feeling is, as long as the kid is willing to engage in a pro and con conversation, I don't want kids to say, no, as long as they're willing to discuss it, let it go with the kid's decision. Because when you say, this is going to be your call, kids are responsible for their own decision. They don't want to make a bad decision.
And this is a great segue into probably the most important overarching theme, I think, of both books is parent as consultant. Yeah. I come from a sales background, and I discovered kind of quickly, because wrestling with people isn't fun, right? I learned pretty quickly that there was this way to have people self-discover and ask to buy. It's actually amazing. It's highly counterintuitive, because what it requires is understanding, how to say no and how to not, force yourself on people, right?
Yeah,
that's what you were trained to do, right? But once you can do it, if you're given the opportunity to do it, magic really happens, and that's kind of the consultant role. And it's something that I've had the blessing to immerse myself in day and day out as a sales professional.
Wow.
Right. So it's hard, but that said, it's extremely difficult for me to apply it in the home. Right. There's different dynamics that you bring there. Right. So maybe we can talk about that consultant aspect of what this is about, because at the end of the day, it's proven communication techniques, right? I don't do this to sell. Now do my bedside manner is to connect with people, right?
Yeah.
If you can do that, self-discovery happens. And if everybody's there for the right reasons, and I promise you, parents, every kid, like Dr. Stixrud said, wants to be successful. If you can create an environment where they start having self-discovery, they'll start pointing out the best solutions, and they'll give you an opportunity, not to tell them where to go, but to guide them where to go, right? So that's a really complex part. You don't gloss over it by any stretch, but it's something that I think, and I think that's why you followed up with the next book, right? But I think there's a lot more that can be done there in terms of just awareness of how important that is, and the work maybe that the individual needs to do on their own to get competence there, to be able to run that type of environment in their home.
Right. And I mean, I think the context for me is that the goal that Ned Johnson, my co-author, and I have for kids is that they're able to run their own life before we send them off to college or wherever they go after high school. But they have practice while they're at home running their own life. And I wouldn't send a kid off to college who can't get himself out of bed, can't manage his technology, can't organize his academic life and keep track, who's dependent on adults to do stuff for him. You don't want to send a kid off to college. So that's the goal. And part of that, so that this idea of parent as consultant is simply that as kids get older, we should shift more into a consulting mode where we don't always know what's right for a kid. We don't know who the kid wants to be, but we have a lot of wisdom to share. We have a lot of advice, and we at times we set limits at times, work out limits with kids at times. But the idea, mainly what we're trying to do is help our kid figure out who he wants to be and how to help him become who he wants to be, and craft the life that he wants to craft. It's, in my opinion, that's really what makes most sense if you want kids to be successful and want them to be able to enjoy their success as they get older.
And one of the easiest things to being a consultant, if you're in a kind of, I got to kind of force the issue to get the sale or to get my child to do what needs to be done. And you said it, be crazy about your kid, right? One of the things I do with my clients, just like be genuinely curious about and learn to be amazed at the little things that they're doing and the little things that they're saying to you, right? And just be in the moment and stop and ask, questions about those little things that you probably are letting go by, right?
Yeah.
So be crazy about your kids. That's low hanging fruit, doctor. You deal with parents and kids as part of the Stixrud Institute. Do you see that as a challenge you're coaching? That simple thing?
Yeah, so what happened with me is I went through a period in my life in my kind of early mid 20s where I was kind of out of sync with the people who've been friends with a long time, and I hadn't made new friends, and so I had the experience of just not that many people were happy to see me, but there's this one couple that I even if I'd stop them unannounced that I've been friends with for years, they're always spontaneously glad to see me. I just remembered how nourishing that was, that people spontaneously being happy to see me. So when I used to do tons of psychotherapy with parents and families, and what I'd say, let's set our highest goal is simply being able to enjoy your kid. Because so many parents were frustrated or mad at their kid, or they felt guilty, or they're really worried about them. And I said, let's try to change the energy so that you find periods in the day where you just enjoy the kid, so the kid can experience himself as a joy-producing organism, as opposed to an anxiety or frustration or anger-producing organism. And so what we do is we work backwards. It's stress at work. Well, let's focus on that. Or it's like, he does this thing that drives me crazy. Well, let's think about how to handle that situation. But the goal was simply enjoying your kids. Well, I think probably the best thing you can do is simply enjoy being with your kids. Then they know, they can tell.
Yeah, I know the parents struggle with this. I'm part of a couple men's groups, and it's a very common challenge that fathers share, right? The ability to be in the moment, let the chaos be enjoyed, right? It doesn't need to be controlled.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And just coming back for a second to this parent as consultant idea, that I landed on this idea very early in my career, actually in 1986, because I saw so many families of kids who had learning disabilities or ADHD, who they'd fight for 3 hours a night about homework. And it just seemed so crazy, especially what I learned in 1986 for the first time, still true, that homework doesn't seem to contribute to learning in elementary school. So it's really not necessary. I find all this unnecessary fighting and suffering. And so I wrote this thing that wrote a paper that ended up in McCall's magazine on how not to fight with your kid about homework. And I simply said, tell your kid, I love you too much to fight with you about your homework. And I'm willing to do anything I can to help you. I'm willing to get a tutor if you need it. I'm willing to sit with you. I'm willing to be your homework consultant. I'm willing to sit. I'll sit with you from 6:30 to 7:30 every night. But I'm not willing to fight with you. I love you too much. I'm not willing to chase you around and try to get you to do your homework. Obviously, I couldn't make you do it. All you have to do is flop to the floor or close your eyes. I couldn't make you do it. So we shift that energy from feeling that somehow we're supposed to be able to make our kids do stuff. You really can't. And that's where we would change the energy. We don't, as you're saying in sales, you say you are trying to force something on people. And you're changing the energy. And when you don't force and you take this respectful attitude, people come to you, just as you're saying in sales. You're much more likely to have kids go along with you if you treat them respectfully and don't force.
And I mentioned that the dynamic of the home is much different, right? I think it's a little bit more high stress. If I get kicked out of the office or they say no, no big deal. I'd rather have them say no than get kicked out of the office, by the way.
Yeah.
That's more the wrestle with them. But if they say no, or it's discovered that, there's not a fit, walk out of the office, no big deal. Parents, deal with their own anxiety, right? So it's hard to enter that consultant mode. So you're very much into transcendental meditation as well as part of your therapy with children and families. My son and I started meditating. Just a few nights ago, and he's enjoying it. He looks forward to it already, right? And I know we're just starting, and we'll go through the excitement, and we'll have to stick through it. But I have my experience with mindfulness on a daily basis, and it should have been a no-brainer to bring it to the child, but also bring it to those situations very as a consultant, right? Hey, I got to manage my house. Okay, this is where the consultant actually needs to show up. I know he or she needs to be there. And a way to access that consultant in high stress is to prepare yourself. And TM's a great way to do it, or any type of mindfulness, right? So I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that. I've listened to it a ton, so yeah.
Yeah. So in both of our books, we talk about how useful it is for virtually any organization if the people in charge can serve as a non-anxious presence, meaning someone who is not highly anxious and emotionally reactive. And you think about it, if you got an infant who's crying, it's much easier to soothe the infant if you stay calm. If you got a 3-year-old who's having a tantrum in the store, it's much easier to deal with it if you don't freak out and start yelling. That you got a 15-year-old who comes home and just flunked a test, or his girlfriend just dumped him, he's really upset. It's much more easier to be helpful if we don't get real anxious, or you should have done this or should have done that. Why didn't you study harder, kind of thing. I didn't make up I wish I did, but I didn't make up this term non-anxious presence. We got it from actually a guy who was a rabbi, a family therapist, and a business consultant named Edwin Friedman. And just the idea that he said that systems, whether it's a family or a corporation or a church or a school or a synagogue, they just work better if the people in charge are not highly anxious and emotionally reactive. And so we in both our books, we just have ideas about how we can move in that direction of being a non-anxious presence. And some of it is the language we choose to use, which is what we focus on in our new book strongly. But some of it is just doing things that allow our brain to stay in that situation with the prefrontal cortex. When we're in our right minds, the prefrontal cortex regulates the rest of the brain, including the amygdala. And that's where we want to stay in that brain state. But we start to get stressed, that goes away. And so the things that we can do that allow our brain to develop to have a really healthy stress response, where we aren't that stressed most of the time, something stressful happens, we deal with it, and then we go back down to our normal state. And I think that TM helps that obviously sleep, exercise, and meditation are the 3 things I think that really have been shown to be very, very effective in helping you be kind of moving that direction, at least, of being a non-anxious presence.
Yeah. Exercise is huge, right? That's part of my daily practice. So I'll just speak to the parents just to for a second here. If you didn't catch it from Bill, get your exercise in, right? That's important. It's not something that you can put off. It's going to help everything. And have your kids get their exercise in too.
Well, it's huge, and I will say that what kids need more than anything, the biggest shortage in kids' lives is childhood play. Because we talk about in the first book, we mentioned a social scientist at Boston University by the name of Peter Gray, who says kids need much more play, much less school. And is talking about even pretty older kids in a lot of because human young are so slow to develop, and the way historically, from an evolutionary point of view, they develop is through play, is through kind of rough and tumble play, creative play, dramatic play, and not through adult-led play, and not through electronic play, but through that engagement with other kids, where they make up the games. They do it. Their kids go off on a Saturday or Sunday. They come back 10 hours later, and they've kind of made their own day. And I've subscribed to this idea that as a species we evolved with the young learned how to be adults through play. And I think we've dramatically short-circuited play. So I want to put in a plug for that aspect of exercise as well.
Yeah, like I said, I think before we start recording, my wife's been, she's an occupational therapist. So she's she had our son in a play-based preschool and kindergarten. So it's kind of surprising that we want to take advantage of the public education system, but we were well primed for this Montessori type education. But to the point of play, kids aren't getting out and playing that much anymore. I don't have teenagers. Conrad, he's 7 years old. So, I'm noticing that he's not out like I was. I lived in a, very middle-class neighborhood, very tightly aligned home. So it was packed with kids just on the block. I told you we live in somewhat horse country out here in Chester County. So it's a lot different. It's harder for my son to just get up and play with kids. But we want to foster that. We do the best we can. And we're always looking for ways to improve. How do you see play becoming, an asset in the community? Like, do you see programs and initiatives that are outside of school where people are seeing the opportunity to create, purposefully and intentionally create these environments for children? So I'm thinking of community building.
Yeah. It's a really good question, Joe. And I'm there probably are, but I'm not aware. The proliferation of soccer for 2-year-olds is that this adult-led kind of forms of play, structured games, but it's kind of seeping down into very early childhood now, and with electronic games being sold to kids who are 2 and 3, I don't see the pushback in the way that I wish I did. And again, there probably are people who are doing it, but I'm just not aware. I haven't seen it here.
No, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but it's something I just think of as we speak.
No, yeah.
I'm very much into community building, and there's a real opportunity because I know people are looking for opportunities for these outlets. So there's opportunities for people to build these communities. I'm sure they're out there. And I know they're out there, right? I've seen them in my community. So if you're wondering, you're not a part of them, you can go find them on your Facebook groups or wherever you kind of find people in your community getting together to do things together. I think it's happening. Play is really important. That's how people develop. It's not in a structured type way, right? That creates anxiety. Right. And in that open play way, that's how creativity happens. That's how people discover. Do you have anything to say about like the importance of play and how that relates to the importance of self-discovery? Because that's a part that people maybe think that's mystifying. Like, how do I find out who I am? Right. It's kind of just getting out there and getting dirty. Right.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that developing that coherent self, that coherent sense of self, that identity. Well, in Self-Driven Child, we have a chapter called Radical Downtime. And which the idea is that life has become so fast-paced and so stressful that we need more radical kind of downtime. Meaning it just looks like you're wasting time, you're doing nothing. And yet what you're doing is actually extremely good and for your brain and your body. And the 3 forms of radical downtime we talk about are sleep and meditation and daydreaming, just having time to kind of to be in your own head and reflect on yourself. There's a lot of concern because kids spend so much time engaged in electronics now. They don't have a lot of downtime just kind of think about themselves and reflect on their relationships and decide, who do I want to be? But the downtime, but the point you're making about that self-discovery is really interesting, because this guy, Peter Gray at Boston University, he pointed out the dramatic increase in anxiety and depression over the last many years. Also, this dramatic decrease in play, and also decrease in a kid's sense of control. And he said that low sense of control that's triggering the anxiety and depression, and the low sense of control is caused because kids aren't playing. And that self-initiated play. Let's get together. Let's make up a game. Let's build something together. Do something. The kids are off doing it. Kids don't do that very much anymore. And I think it's a very good chance. I mean, it's certainly not the only factor, but I think it's an important factor.
Does playing an instrument help with this? Just putting having the brain I know it's structured, right? But there's a certain amount of creativity. I know you're a musician. I'm a musician. It was maybe one of the most important things when I was in high school. Right. I spent a lot of time alone with my guitar. I wonder. I don't know if you talked about that.
Well, I think it's different. I mean, I think it's different than the kind of play we're talking about. But I think music is great for the brain. It's great for life. And one of the questions that I address in the Self-Driven Child is, well, you're talking about encouraging kids to make their own decision. Music is really important. It's good for the brain. What if my kid doesn't want to practice? And that's the kind of thing that we talk a lot about in both of our books, is how do we manage, if we're going to really not try to force our kids, and we're going to take this kind of consultant role, how does that play out? What if they make decisions that we don't agree with? And so I think that music is very important. But I'm grateful. I'm eternally grateful to my parents for letting me quit piano lessons when I was 8 or 9. Yeah. And I didn't really want to read music. I have a really good ear for music. I didn't want to play that, whatever she used to make me play. And when the Beatles came out, like many people in my generation, I was in a band when I was 14, and I'm still in a rock and roll band, and I play and sing probably more than virtually anybody I know who is forced to practice as a kid. So my feeling is that music is important, but one of the keys for me is you don't want to fight repeatedly with your kid about anything, and certainly not about music practice.
Yeah, I coach as well, wrestling on and off, and right now I'm not, because my son just isn't feeling it, right? And it's we're not gonna line him up to wrestle if he's not feeling it. And the same with music. I'm very well aware that Conrad wants to go, even if he's not enthusiastic. If he wants to go and he knows he has an out, let's take him, right? He knows he has an out. We're consulting, I think. So, and where I got into my connection with play, and I appreciate you pointing out that the music didn't have a direct connection, was that imaginative, that time to kind of get lost, maybe not yourself, but to create something, right? To imagine and create, because there's such a sense of, even if it's not composing something, you've just gone somewhere and done something, and you can step away and say you've done that, right? And that sense of accomplishment is huge for.
No, I think it's an excellent point. And I think most kids who have to take music lessons don't get that. They aren't writing their own music, and right. But when kids do it and they have the opportunity to do it, I love it. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So connection, it all comes back to connection. When you talk about playing and working with your peers and working out how to connect, right? And we started with the brain, and how that's a preventive if you can have a connection for mental health problems in adulthood or later in life. There's a real nurturing that goes on to make that connection. And if you're not making that connection, I think I wanted to point out here that you're creating a lack of actual physical connection in the brain, right? So, and that's where these issues come in. I've studied Gabor Mate recently, where my understanding of ADHD and anxiety as something that was primarily genetic, is genetic, but it's how it's formed in these connections in early childhood as the brain's developing, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
it's very important to that regard, right? Because not only are you making those connections, but by avoidance, by avoiding, being the consultant, right, or creating those anxious presence, creating a non-anxious presence, you're really kind of creating something that you don't want to, and to the point that kids want to have the best for themselves and give them an opportunity to be a consultant. There's a real opportunity for people to step back and find consultants for themselves, or be their own consultant in understanding how to do this, right? I just think that's really important for people to understand, right? You really got to step into this if you've gotten this information so far. If you've had the fortune of running into Ned Johnson's book and Dr. Stixrud's book, don't avoid it, step into it, right? So
Well, it's true, and this connection piece in our new book, What Do You Say? We talk about, we knew that that strong relationship with the parent, that close relationship with the parent, is like a silver bullet, as I said, for protecting kids. And when we were writing our new book, we interviewed, we had these focus groups, and so we met with dozens and dozens of mainly older children and adolescents, and we asked them a lot of questions. And one of the questions was simply, who do you feel closest to on this planet? And very commonly, sometimes as a parent, but very commonly as a teacher or a coach or an uncle or an older cousin, or a school counselor. And we said, what is it about this person that makes you feel close? And invariably the kid says something on the order of, they listen to me without judging me, and they don't tell me what to do. And I thought this is so, and this made complete sense to us, because we know that one of the most important keys for developing that closest kids is empathy. And the way we're wired as humans, if kids come to us and they're upset about something, we want to make it, we want to soothe them. So either we try to talk, oh, you don't need to be afraid, that kind of thing, or we say, well, do this. We tell them what to do to make it better. And ideally, what we do is, when kids are upset, when the kids are really afraid, is we said, it sounds like you're really scary. It sounds like you're really, so we're letting them know, I'm understanding how you're feeling. And it's empathy and validation. And the validation piece is, I think if I was in that situation, I'd probably feel scared too. Most people would feel scared, that it's normal to feel the way you feel. There's nothing wrong with the way you feel. And I think when we lead with empathy and validation, what happens is that kids just spontaneously, as you're kind of implying, they start to discover and to try to figure things out themselves. Ned and I were giving a lecture in California right before the pandemic, and we were talking about some of this stuff. And the next morning, the woman who organized our lecture got an email from somebody who was there, and she said, I heard Ned and Bill talk last night. And when I got home from the lecture, my 13-year-old son came to me crying. He said, I'm the weakest kid in 7th grade. And he was really upset. And I normally would have said, no, you're right. I couldn't be right. Or I would have said, well, we'll call the gym teacher tomorrow and we'll kind of get a program for you. But I didn't do that. I just said, that sucks. I mean, if I wanted to be strong, and if I felt like I was the weakest kid, I feel pretty upset too. So I want to be able to help. Let's sleep on it and talk about it in the morning. And so in the morning, the kid comes to her with a handwritten plan for how he's going to get stronger, that he did generate himself. And she said it was just so incredible, just that change in energy. I didn't have to solve it for him. And in fact, by just being by expressing empathy and understanding, and non-judgment, that he went to work solving the problem himself. And so a lot of this stuff that we talk about in both of our books, it takes practice. But there's some things like this. You just change the energy. I think that when you're talking about what you're doing in sales, you're talking about changing the energy in a relationship in a way that makes people receptive, as opposed to trying to ward you off. That's what we're trying to do with kids too.
Yeah, and I was going to come home to that point again, the energy point. I think you said it 4 or 5 times now in different parts of the conversation. How did you know that this was going to be your life's work? You mentioned going back to the 80s, right? So if you're getting to the Beatles in the 60s, 50s, right? So I guess, yeah, it's your life's work, right? You've been doing this as your entire professional career, right?
Well, I've had an interesting life. I mean, I've been playing music by rock and roll, but I got very anxious my last few years in college. It's a long story, but family issues and stuff. But I did well. So I got into the top English doctoral program in English literature in the country at Berkeley. And I went
whoa, that's, hey, as a former lit major, congratulations.
Well,
that's impressive.
I was pretty puffed up about it, but I was so anxious and insecure that I went 2 straight quarters without turning any work. I didn't turn a single assignment, and so I flunked out. And for me, it felt like I'd never been more humiliated. I didn't know what on earth I had this fantasy of being a 26-year-old English professor. I didn't have any idea what I was going to do. And so at that time, at least 2 or 3 people told me I was the most nervous person they'd ever met. Wow. And so luckily one of the people said, who just learned TM, they said, if there's anybody on this planet who needs to learn to meditate, it's you. So I went back home to Seattle, where I'm from, and I learned to meditate. And it took me about a month to realize that flunking out of graduate school was the best thing that could have ever happened to me, because I always felt like an imposter with literature types. It wasn't me. And I had a 4-year-old niece who I just loved being with. Well, maybe I'll do something with children. So I got certified as a teacher, but I was a terrible teacher because I couldn't manage a classroom. So I figured, I like kids, but I got to work one-on-one. So I went back to graduate school in psychology and became a psychologist. And it really, that experience of flunking out of graduate school was really kind of informative to me and informing for me in the sense that it felt like a big disaster. And it took 30 days for me to realize it was the best possible thing that happened. And that's partly why I feel so strongly about encouraging kids to make their own decisions, as long as they're making informed decisions. Meaning they talk with people who know more about it than they do, so they can make a decision. Because we don't. Sorry.
Don't worry about it, Bill. It's all good.
Because we don't.
It's an informal show. We're not on network news. Hey, Star, how are you? It's all good. It's all good. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. So, but the idea is that we don't always know what's in the kid's best interest. I mean, because so often what happens, it seems like a disaster. I mean, that I talked to a family I talked to a mother the other day whose kid was failing, I don't know how you do this, but almost flunked 6th grade. He was just doing nothing. And I'm coaching him on this not trying to rush in and solve him, not trying to micromanage him, let it be between him and the school, and then say, how can I help, honey? And I just talked to the mom today, he's got, as an 8th grader, he's got straight A's. He's applying to high schools, and he's just on this complete turnaround that they wouldn't have seen this coming. And it was really him having to wrestle. And I'm sorry to use it over and over again, but they changed the energy. So they weren't trying to get him to work and on top of him all the time and fearful. They took a more calm approach and saying, we know you can figure this out. It doesn't have to be today, it doesn't have to be tomorrow, but we know you can figure this out, and we're here to help you in any way we can. And almost predictably, that he kind of stepped up to the plate. And it happens like that.
Hey, we believe in you, and by the way, we're crazy about you as well. Not only do we believe in you, I think you're awesome. Like we were just talking about it. Me and your dad were just talking about it last night about how awesome this thing you did the other day was. So you mentioned,
yeah. There's nothing better. Just telling kids. We have a lot of these language like this in our new book. Just telling kids, like, I got so lucky having you as my son. I just hit the lottery. Just that kind of thing. It's just kids remember that the rest of their life.
Yeah, I don't know if this is something I picked up from somebody else, but it's part of what you said. If you're anxious, you avoid, right? And I think that's part of your
Right.
anecdote there.
Right.
And
Right.
if you're avoiding things, namely life in general, you can't grow, right? You were avoiding your studies, your literature, what you were doing. Totally avoided it. You didn't go anywhere. You actually literally didn't go anywhere. You didn't stand in anything. That's a great picture of what the anxiety does. And once you remove that, what happened? You flourished.
Well, it's true that avoidance is the major manifestation of anxiety. It's so interesting that a close friend of mine was the first person I ever knew who did a 30-day outpatient treatment program for marijuana addiction. This is like in 1980, where he'd been trying to quit for smoking every day since he was 15. He couldn't quit. And he was really troubled by the fact that he couldn't quit. So he did this program, and my wife and I, he didn't have any family in town, so we went to a family session with him and a couple. And one of the things we remember one of the counselors saying is that you've been smoking pot every day since you're 15. So you're really 15 years old emotionally, even though he was 25. So because the way you grew up emotionally is you feel your feelings and you deal with them. And if you use the pot to avoid dealing with your feelings, you don't grow emotionally. And we see, I see this play out in so many different contexts, because if kids aren't doing their schoolwork, there's usually two explanations. One is they have ADHD, and their brain it's just not interesting enough for the brain to activate, or it's anxiety. The schoolwork makes them anxious, so they avoid doing it. And there's a story in a new book where I was at a meeting at a Catholic school. This kid who I just tested, he's in 8th grade. So at Catholic schools, this school ends at 8th grade. So they're applying out to Catholic high school. So there's a lot of pressure to do well. This kid's just completely tanking. And he has learning disabilities and ADHD and a language disorder. School is really hard for him. And I go to the school meeting, and the principal, who I love, said, well, I've already had 2 meetings with him about how important it is that he turn this around, because it's a 4-year decision. And I said, respectfully, my feeling is that it's not lost on him that if he did better in school, he'd have more options for high school. It's not, and I suspect he's probably tried quite a bit to do better, and just found that no matter how hard he tries, he just can't do that well. I think we're going to do better if we tell him it's not that big a deal. Who cares where you go to high school? I mean, nobody's going to care when you're 30 or 40. It's not that big a deal. I want you to work on this. I want you to kind of get better and better and better, but you don't have to turn things around immediately. And they kind of respected me, and they tried this message, and it really did shift his kids, because if we spend 90 units of energy trying to help a kid do something, and we try to use fear to motivate them, what happens is they just do less and less and less, and it doesn't change until we change the energy.
And maybe a good way, I know we're getting close to time, and maybe it's a great way to wrap it up. You've gotten this information, you want to go start working with your kids and in your house. Maybe you have in the back of your head, maybe there is some ADHD or something I should check out, right, as part of this. How do you help parents not avoid that? Maybe give them some confidence, because it is a real thing. I know that you work with kids and you can help them out. Maybe there's somebody listening to this who's avoiding that. Is there anything you could say to that, Doctor?
Well, in my experience, I've tested. I'm a neuropsychologist, and I test kids for a living. I test kids and teenagers and young adults, and I test them if they're having learning problems or attention problems or emotion problems or social problems. And I try to figure out what they're good at, where their strengths are, what's hard for them, why it's hard, and how to help them. And I found that it's just valuable to kind of know. So what I advise parents is, if you have questions about your kids that some professional can answer, you get them answer. And certainly that I think that there's a number of things that can, for ADHD, for example, there's a number of things that can help, including meditation. If kids will do it, it can be a nice tool. It's also true that for a lot of kids, the medication for ADHD is just life-changing. And I think for a lot of families who've not wanted to kind of avoided kind of going down there, what they eventually do They kick themselves for not having done it earlier, not having kind of discovered this earlier. So I do think that that if you find somebody that you trust to kind of to evaluate your kid, knowing is there a learning problem here, knowing is there a attention problem here, having a lens to kind of understand a kid is a helpful thing.
And thanks, doctor. I'll tie that to a physical ailment. I was avoiding telling a doctor about a shoulder problem I was having because I was afraid that, hey, MRI surgery, right? He's like, no, Joe, I finally told him, he's like, no, just go to a physical therapist and we'll go from there, right? Like, that's don't jump the gun. And it was great. 8 weeks with a physical therapist, shoulders wonderful. Right. So
I couldn't lift my left shoulder a couple of months ago, and I was sure that I tore my rotator cuff. So I go to this orthopedist, and I actually 24 hours later I could do this and lift my shoulder. And he tested my strength. He said the diagnosis for you is 71-year-old rotator cuff.
Hey, you got your answer. Now you know what to do, right?
That's right. That's right.
Go get the answers. And what you might end up doing is learning so much about the brain, because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about ADHD, right? That's part of addressing it, is learning about it. You're probably going to turn into a consultant in your home just by getting to understand the brain, because it's all about how do you address that type of brain and how do you set it up for a good environment. So.
Joe, I was talking last night to a group of parents in Mclean, Virginia, which is a very wealthy kind of upper middle class suburb of DC. And what was I going to tell you? There's just tremendous amount of academic pressure. So somebody asked, one of the questions they asked me at the end of the talk, I was talking about our new book, was, well, how do we prepare kids in elementary school and middle school for the intense pressure of college related pressure in high school? And I said that, in my experience, people in our area they're thinking about college as delusional, in the sense that they have the idea that the most important outcome of a kid's childhood and adolescence is where they go to college, which is just ridiculous. So if you actually look at the research on this, it's just, if you just talk to people who didn't go to elite colleges, who are incredibly successful, it's ridiculous. But it's like a cancer. And so what I said to them is that the first thing you can do is simply convincing yourself that it's crazy, it's delusional, and be really clear with your kid about that. But this idea that there's so many things that are more important, and from I'm coming back to the brain, but for Ned and I, the most important outcome of childhood and adolescence is where you go to college. It's sculpting a brain that can be very focused, that is not used to being chronically stressed, chronically tired, chronically overloaded. That's the most important outcome, is sculpting a brain. And we know that particularly teenagers, that the connections that are being made in their brain in teenage years are the connections they'll have when they're adult. And the brain is malleable. And it's not like we're locking in patterns that are just completely impossible to change. But what we don't want is kids to sacrifice 4 years in high school and sleep 5 hours a night and develop anxiety disorders or depression, who otherwise wouldn't need to, because it changes the brain in a way that makes them more vulnerable later in life. And so this idea is, both our books, we focus on promoting healthy brain development as our highest goal.
Thank you. And I'm thanking you, because I think that was pretty brave to stand up in front of a bunch of parents in Mclean, Virginia. I know Mclean very well, and I know it's probably pretty aggressive, for lack of a better term, when it comes to the academic achievements and getting into the best school. So to say that, I know you probably made a couple friends, but you probably had a couple people walking our way saying, they got to watch who they bring in here to speak to us, right? I don't know, like, what was the reception like? Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, we're popular in Mclean, and I've been lecturing about this stuff in this area and writing about it for many years now, and they love the self-driven child. And see, these people who think that they love the idea that it's not true. They love the idea that they don't have to be so fearful. It's just hard because the whole environment. You know, there's a woman, local woman who came to four of Ned's and my lectures about the self-driven child, and I said, "Why do you keep coming?" She said, "Every time I hear you talk, I put things in perspective, and I'm not so anxious about my kid. Then the next day, I talk to another parent, I get all wound up again." And so that's partly why we wanted to put this stuff in writing so that people can reread it and just remind themselves that you don't have to worry about your kid all the time. You don't have to be on top of your kid all the time. That you can skillfully learn how to set limits where necessary. And we have the last chapter in our new book. It's called "What About Consequences?" So, but it's about kind of how you work out limits with kids, but in a way that preserves your relationship with them. So you can do this in a way where you don't have to constantly be worried, don't have to constantly be on your kid.
Well, listen, my big thing is sharing your talents. You're certainly sharing your talent in Mclean. They're getting a high dose of it, and seeing is believing for a lot of people. So just being able to hear that counterintuitive message, to your point, you're right. They're happy to hear it because finally I've seen somebody with credibility say it, and that's a little bit of a relief, and I can lean into it. So thanks for getting out there and sharing your talent. It's important, and you're getting people to go out there and share their talent, which is being a great parent. So maybe we can have a follow-up sometime and talk about consequences and some of the application of these things, because we spent so much time talking about the high level. I think it's important to set the ground that way, and why this is all.
Yeah, happy to join you again. It's really fun to talk to you, Joe.
Bill, I couldn't avoid calling you a doctor either. This is high regard for the work.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.